Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. I'm Matt Levitt. I have the pleasure of directing the Washington Institute's Program on Counterterrorism and Intelligence. And it is a greater pleasure still today to have with me Aaron Zelin and Ambassador Jacob Wallace for what will prove to be, I'm sure, a fabulous event to discuss the phenomenon of Tunisia's foreign fighters. Aaron Zelin is the Richard Burrow Fellow here in the Washington Institute's Counterterrorism and Intelligence Program. He is a visiting research scholar at Brandeis University and the author of the forthcoming book, Your Sons Are at Your Service, Tunisia's Missionaries of Jihad, to be published forthwith by Columbia University Press. This explores the history of Tunisian jihadist movement, and he has also founded the widely cited website jihadology.net, which is a tremendous resource to all of us who research these issues and appreciate having a safe spot on the internet where we can reach this material that won't put viruses on our computers. And Ambassador Wallace is uniquely qualified to be with us on this panel here today. He's retired from the U.S. Foreign Service. He retired in March 2017 after a distinguished 35-year career, which included, among many other things, service as U.S. ambassador to Tunisia and later as a senior advisor on foreign fighters in the State Department's Counterterrorism Bureau. After leaving government, the ambassador joined the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace as a non-resident fellow, and he is no stranger to the Washington Institute or indeed to this podium. So with no further ado, Aaron, let me turn it over to you, and then Ambassador Wallace will offer some commentary. We'll open up to questions and answers. We will end sharply at 2 o'clock. If you have not already silenced your phones, please do so now. Thank you very much.
All right. Thanks, everyone, for coming. Thanks for Matt for the kind introduction and the endorsement of my website. It's been an interesting last week. It's nice to be back in D.C. And thanks to Ambassador Wallace for agreeing to add his insights based on his experiences in Tunisia and his advice related to the foreign fighting phenomenon with the State Department. So today I didn't want to get too in the weeds of the paper. So for those who want like a lot of detail, rich detail, you can go online onto the website and you can find it. There's also a lot of tables and maps there. You can click on the maps and you can zoom in and out to find really detailed information there. But today I just wanted to get into some of the key points related to the paper, which are important to note. So one of the first key points I think is important to highlight is that the historical Tunisian logistical and facilitation networks related to the Iraq jihad, meaning the mobilization that went to Iraq from 2003 to 2009, provided easy connection to Syria in the more recent years from 2011-12 onwards. So in terms of Iraq specifically, the first group of known foreign fighters to actually go to Iraq came in the fall of 2002. These were a group of Tunisians that were living in Marseille, France, as well as some Iraqis that were living in France that went to Kurdistan, right on the border with Iran, where Zarqawi at the time was building himself up before the U.S. even invaded yet, which would happen about 6 months later. It's also important to note this because the history of what was going on in Iraq laid the seeds for many of the activities that we saw in Tunisia afterwards. So for example, Hassan Brick, who was the head of Dawah or proselytization or outreach efforts for Ansar al-Sharia in Tunisia after the Tunisian revolution in 2011, actually helped out with a safe house in Syria, moving fighters from Syria into Iraq last decade. So you can see how these connections made last decade became important more recently. Additionally, if you look at some of the key recruitment and facilitation networks last decade, there's an important individual named Abu Umar al-Tunisi. We didn't really know who this guy was for many years. It only became known more recently in the last 2 or 3 years that this guy was Tariq al-Harzi. He was an important individual within the efforts of Zarqawi's network, but then later the Islamic State of Iraq, and then ISIS, and of course IS, for recruiting foreign fighters to Iraq, and then later Syria. What's interesting to note, though, is that his brother Ali al-Harzi, who was in Iraq last decade too, also ended up helping out with the recruitment related to this as well. But he did it from Libya after 2011, and he was actually one of the individuals involved in the consulate attack in Benghazi. And besides that, he trained individuals, especially Tunisians, that then went on to Syria. So related to this then is sort of AST, or Ansar al-Sharia's sanctioning and incubation of foreign fighting in Tunisia after the 2011 revolution. So before Syria became sort of the jihad du jour, they were still recruiting people to Iraq prior to Syria really bubbling up. Just to note this, the leader of AST, Abu Ayyad al-Tunisi, in a December 2011 interview, noted that, quote, "If you come to me and say, quote, I want to go to Iraq," he said, "I will not prevent you, because if I do, I will be sinful, because you want to realize one of the obligations, which is supporting Muslims and fighting the enemies of our religion." This excitement for jihad and Tunisians' involvement in it did not wane over time, of course. In February 2013, Abu Ayyad, in a different interview, noted that Tunisians could be found everywhere in the land of jihad. The ways of going are easy, and we do not stop anyone from leaving. So as you can see, even though the group was based in Tunisia and it was focused on proselytizing, and they weren't really that violent in Tunisia at the time, they still had connections and efforts as it related to what was going on abroad, whether it was to Iraq and Syria or even to Libya next door. In addition, their official Facebook page at the time was promoting the Syrian jihad, as well as Tunisians that went over there and died as martyrs. So this is a way to incite other individuals to potentially go so that they could be glamorized in the same fashion. And one last thing to note that is important is a key recruiter within Tunisia, Bilal Kouachi. He was a key individual on the streets of Tunisia who was going to people and helping sort of radicalize them to then decide to go on to Syria eventually. And additionally, at the time, from 2011 to end of 2013, he also had the opportunity to go on television shows at night during prime time and have debates with different individuals. It's important to contextualize that in this period, in the first 2 years after the revolution, that jihadis were allowed to openly operate without too much harassment due to the way the government was dealing with them, since they felt that it was better to dialogue with them than to crack down upon them. That being said, as they gained strength over time, the government wasn't too happy about this because it became a larger threat to their own power base. So starting with the crackdown of AST in the spring of 2013, which then culminated in the group's terrorist designation in August 2013 by the Tunisian government, this led to an even early flow of foreign fighters, which coincided with the Islamic State of Iraq, which is what the group was calling itself at the time, when it went into Syria and became ISIS in April 2013. So in terms of the numbers specifically, there's been a lot of complications related to, you've heard numbers like 5,000, 6,000, 7,000, what have you. It doesn't really make sense, and the Tunisian government also never really stated this for whatever reason. Other people mention this in media reports, but based off of the data that I've gathered, as well as reports by the Tunisian government more recently, it tracks more that a little more than 2,900 or so individuals actually went. That doesn't necessarily mean, though, that the mobilization wasn't large. They stopped about 27,000 people between 2012 and about 2017. So there was still a large amount of people that wanted to go. They just weren't allowed to go. What's interesting, though, about this mobilization is that everybody, of course, talks about the announcement of IS's caliphate in June 2014 and how that spurned a large group of people to go to Syria in particular, but also Iraq as well. But what's interesting when you look at the data and sort of the trajectory of this mobilization, at least for the Tunisians specifically, is that most Tunisians who mobilized to join groups in Iraq and Syria did so between March 2013 and June 2014. This date range, of course, is perhaps surprising given the fact that ISIS's caliphate announcement was in June, as I mentioned. A number of factors can explain this surge in this period and not later. The heightened showdown between AST and the Tunisian government in the spring of 2013, The April 2013 announcement of ISIS, as it was known then, going into Syria, it was just as motivating as the caliphate announcement was to many of the Tunisians. And the Tunisians that had already been in Syria at that juncture, who were fighting with Jabhat al-Nusra, which was more aligned with al-Qaeda in later years, ended up defecting and switching to ISIS. In addition, at that point, the Tunisian government really hadn't started to crack down harshly against the efforts of people going abroad to fight. And then in terms of the later time period, what's interesting is that you saw the rise of the Libyan theater next door, whereby in the spring and summer of 2014, IS was already sending Tunisian operatives who had been in Syria to build up its infrastructure in Libya ahead of its official announcement in November 2014 that the group there was part of IS and that they're expanding their provinces beyond Iraq and Syria to Libya as well as other countries as well. And this is just a slide to show some of the data in relation to it. You can get into it more, but you could see that at least based off of the earliest data, they started mobilizing in around April 2012. And the most recent data that the Tunisian government really put out was in December 2016. So it's possible that the numbers have gone up, but based off of what we know related to the overall mobilization, not too much has changed. But you could see that the number of people that have been stopped went up a lot over time between 2013 and 17. And then we've seen that people up to about 550, at least that's you can look at online and find data about it, have died, though it's likely more. And then about 970 individuals have returned back to Tunisia as of March this year. So one of the things to also note is that this is a national phenomenon. If you look at the foreign fighter mobilization from some countries, you might see people specifically from one city or one neighborhood or maybe 2 or 3 villages or have you. But if you look at the case of Tunisia, these people are coming from a lot of different parts of the country. Of course, there's a great glut of people in the Bizerte region, in the Tunis region, in the central part in Sousse and Monastir. But as you can tell, it's been touched by a lot of parts of the country, and it's not just something that can be dealt with in one area and sort of quarantine it in some ways. It needs to have local solutions in all these locations because the reasons people are going is different depending on their own background or situation personally. In addition to this, it's important to note, looking at the data related to those who died in Syria in particular, that you could tell that more Tunisians ended up fighting with ISIS, which isn't surprising. These are the totals, at least based off of open data related to it. And what's interesting when you look at the data, and this map is where Tunisians died in Syria, is that the number of people that died with Jabhat al-Nusra is a lot larger than the number of people that died with their successor organizations, Jabhat Fatah al-Sham or Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which further illustrates that many of the Tunisians that had originally been with Nusra and their group ended up going to ISIS, since the later groups that Nusra became, not that many Tunisians died with them. Besides the numbers aspects of this, it's important to look at sort of what are the motivations behind why people are going. This isn't an easy issue. Humans are complicated, as we know, in our own personal lives. I'm obviously not going to go through every single one in lots of detail, but it's important to note that some of the main ones included altruism, anti-colonialism, a bandwagon effect, disillusionment with the Tunisian post-revolution political stage, pursuit of economic opportunities, the establishment of the caliphate, impressionability of young guys trying to fit in, open conditions, which we discussed related to Ansar al-Sharia, sort of personal tragedy in somebody's life, prison radicalization, recidivism amongst people from a prior generation, desire for redemption, a sense of religious void, as well as sectarianism. I'm just only going to get into 2 or 3 of these just to illustrate some points. So one of them I think that's really important and is interesting is the idea of disillusionment sort of with the politics of Tunisia after the revolution. Many Tunisians had great hopes following the fall of the government of President Ben Ali in 2011. These were especially prevalent among highly educated youth, but they're experiencing high levels of unemployment, possibly up to 50%. Yet despite gradual political process over the past 7 years, the economic fruits that so many have yearned for have yet to emerge. As a consequence, many young people have become steadily disillusioned with the political process within Tunisia, and they believe many of the elites have only benefited. In turn, Tunisians sought alternative pathways to economic success, or at the very least pursuing significant outside of a system that still marginalized a lot of young individuals. One way was through migration to Europe and pursuing more abundant opportunities there, while others sought relief within the jihadist movement with its sense of mission, infusion of pride, and immediate social benefits. It did not hurt that groups like AST and later IS were just then rising and promoting a new form of governance that called for skilled youth to carry out their program, which sought ostensibly to improve society just under a theocratic rather than a democratic rubric. Tunisia's first president after the revolution, Monsef Marzouki, summed up this dilemma well when he said, quote, "We had a dream. Our dream was called the Arab Spring, and our dream is now turning into a nightmare. But the young people need a dream, and the only dream available to them now is the caliphate," end quote. A young Tunisian filmmaker whose cousin was then fighting in Syria confirmed this sentiment when asked whether joining IS seemed normal to them. He said, quote, "If you lived in Tunisia and you're experiencing daily subjugation and injustice, and you have ideas, and you have principles, and you have objectives, and you have a vision for the future, and if you live in a state that doesn't embrace you, then it's the opposite. It's very normal." So in terms of another reason people went, of course, is not surprisingly the establishment of the caliphate. When IS announced it had reestablished the caliphate, the news was greeted by supporters greatly. Of course, that didn't carry much legitimacy within the broader Muslim community, but some saw a new opportunity for justice where Muslims were once again on top instead of being bullied through colonialism or disregarded by their local Arab secular, military, or monarchical authoritarian systems. This is why a Tunisian named Ahmed, for example, supported IS. He said, "The Islamic State is a true caliphate, a system that is fair and just, where you don't have to follow somebody's orders because he is rich or powerful. It is action, not theory, and it will topple the whole game." Likewise, Ridda from Jinduba, who traveled to Syria in 2013, said he wanted to join IS because he was attracted by the radical ideology and was convinced that he would be on the front lines of defending his faith and bringing Sharia to the masses. Additionally, you had Fatima, a Tunisian who contested the idea that women join IS for jihad al-nikah, or a euphemism for sex jihad or providing comfort to fighters, a notion that was propagated by the Tunisian government as disinformation against this movement. Undoubtedly, IS engaged in sexual abuse, but no credible evidence has emerged to suggest that women who joined IS did so to comfort fighters. For her part, the Tunisian Khadija Omri said that she went to Syria with her husband in hope of, quote, leading the kind of religious lifestyle they had long dreamt of. It was for jihad, for Sharia and the Islamic State. I really believed that there was a state where we could live like the Prophet, end quote. Similarly, Bara al-Tunisi, a former IS member, said she came to Syria as a woman wanting to be empowered by Islamic principles. And then finally, the last motivation that I'm going to discuss is the idea of redemption. According to Ahmed, who is a former IS adherent, after his brother Rashid went to Syria, he saw online that this was a means for recruitment. He explained that, quote, "The jihadi recipe begins simmering in the minds of young men when they confess past sins to their clerics. Sins that mainly revolve around dating a girl, drinking alcohol, or frequenting bars. The cleric then begins to exaggerate the seriousness of those sins, transforming them into unpardonable offenses that the young man must atone for through certain deeds, the culmination of which is to fight the jihad in Syria." Next, besides the motivational aspects, it's important to look at sort of what these Tunisians actually did once they got to Syria itself and Iraq to a lesser extent. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the different roles that they looked at. And on this slide here, you could see some of the roles that are known publicly. And again, you could go online to the report and look at this a lot easier, since I'm sure the text is kind of small on the screen. So some of the roles included 2 Tunisians who were involved in the torture and execution of the captured Jordanian pilot Muaz Kasasbe. Abu Bilal al-Tunisi was at the scene of Kasasbe's capture and was pictured with his arm around the lieutenant's neck. Following this capture, Rayyan al-Tunisi, who will be discussed a little bit later as well, participated in Kasasbe's torture. According to a female Tunisian IS member who later defected from the group, she said, quote, "It was the most brutal torture I've ever seen." Besides these bloody episodes, though, many Tunisians were engaged in outreach and religious education as part of the IS state-building project. One individual so engaged early on was Abu Waqas al-Tunisi, who became the face of what was then IS's Dawah program and appearing in 6 of its videos by the end of 2013. This is an important and underappreciated dynamic because, as we saw within Tunisia earlier, they were primarily involved in outreach and governance and not so much violence. So when Tunisians were able to go then to Syria and join up with IS and continue this type of work, it very much tracked with what they're doing already, so there wasn't too much of a difference. It was only a difference in name of group necessarily. For their part, though, Tunisian women helped shape the vision of IS's society. The founder of the group's infamous Al-Khansa Brigade, which began operating in February 2014, was a Tunisian woman named Rayyan, who I just mentioned was involved in the torture of the Jordanian pilot. She would also help establish the Al-Khansa Brigade in Libya after IS took control of Sirte, and then moving there from Syria in September 2015. What she did when she instituted this brigade was stationing women at checkpoints to make sure those under the niqab were not men disguised for an ambush, securing marriages for foreigners who joined IS, standardizing displays for women's clothes and mannequins in stores, replacing all male OBGYN doctors with women, and helping develop school curricula for girls. Amongst the women who joined this brigade was Hajar al-Tunisi, who was responsible for Sharia classes and helped recruit women for the groups Diwan al-Ta'alim, or the Administration of Education, and Diwan al-Siha, or the Administration of Health, for an estimated monthly salary of $100 to $200. There's also the case of Abdurrahman al-Tunisi, who helped facilitate arranged marriages in Al Mayadin, Syria, which is in Deir ez-Zor province. Alongside these positions, the notes within the Islamic State's border documents remark on specific skills of interest to the group. For instance, there's Kaka al-Tunisi, who was trained in street fighting and kung fu, Abu Musa al-Tunisi, who had experience in transferring money and importing goods, Abu Sa'ad al-Tunisi, who worked as a smuggler in Libya and Algeria, Abu Yusuf al-Tunisi, who knew some type of software privacy programs, and Abu Mujahid al-Tunisi, who was an expert in hacking encrypted websites, allegedly. This shows how the border documents were used not only to identify individuals that were joining the group, but also to spot potential talent that could be used for them going forward. That being said, not everything went right with IS and the recruits going forward. As I noted, about 970 individuals have since returned to Tunisia from Iraq and Syria. Part of this is due to the issue of disillusionment again, but in the context of disillusionment with ISIS and what they're doing. For example, Sharfaddin Hasni, an ISIS supporter, remained in Tunisia but had multiple friends who traveled to Syria, noted from his interactions with them that they, quote, thought it would be like joining the side of the Prophet Muhammad, but they found it was divided into these small groups with a lot of transgressions they did not expect, like forcing people to fight between Jabhat al-Nusra and the Islamic State. Furthermore, an aspiring combatant named Ghaith, who returned to Tunisia, said, "It was totally different from what they said jihad would be like. It's not a revolution or jihad, it's a slaughter." Moreover, Faisal explains that between the image they give themselves in their videos on the internet, that of the companions of the Prophet, and what they really are, cold and calculating, there is a gap, end quote. That being said, there are challenges related to this. Some of these expressions of disenchantment might not be wholly genuine, instead reflecting an acknowledgement of the Islamic State's loss of territory. For example, after IS began ceding ground, someone like Anwar Bayoud evidently began to see IS members as monsters. Yet, for whatever reason, he and others like him did not express such sentiments when the group was riding high and everything was promising. Similarly, Muhammad Amrouni, after IS began losing Raqqa, began to reach out to his family about returning home. His brother Ajmi said that he, quote, begged for my forgiveness. This is part of the dilemma with returning foreign fighters writ large, not just in Tunisia. Determining whether their remorse is genuine, expressed disillusion with the IS experience, but paired with the hesitancy to disavow the broader ideology and a focus on poor implementation prevents a special conjury. Once home, returnees also face the stigma of having joined a jihadist group, now wearing a proverbial scarlet letter. A former combatant named Rajab concurs that, quote, even the ones that express regret are outcast and marginalized by society. Therefore, because these returnees have no alternative social network in Tunisia, they risk relapsing out of the desire for solidarity and purpose that fomented their mobilization to join in the first place. In some sense, this is why Ajmi Amrouni's expression in reference to his brother Muhammad, who is seeking to return home via extradition from the SDF camps in Syria, said, quote, Inshallah, he is not a threat. This encapsulates the approach taken by Tunisia as well as other governments with the dilemma. Tunis in particular is essentially hoping that everything just works out because at this juncture it offers no governmental level rehabilitation or reintegration initiatives for individuals who fought in Syria, with some returnees either out in societies while others are detained in prison. This is why the future of the movement, as I note in the slide, is brewing within the prison system right now, which includes not just the returnees from Syria or even the returnees from Libya, which is beyond this particular presentation, but also those that have been arrested locally, domestically, for jihadi online activity, fundraising, or attack plotting. It is no doubt a challenge, but the fact that Tunisia is a democracy provides it an advantage that others in the Arab world might not have, since it can involve its robust civil society and not necessarily rely on a purely securitized approach. Whether it is successful remains to be seen, of course, but based on all of this information, it is not surprising and it's easy to see why individuals in the Tunisian government, as well as in Western Europe and the United States, remain worried about what can become of the future of this movement, since there are so many that have returned, so many that wanted to go that were stopped, and so many that are interacting with each other now within the prison system, and there are rumors of sort of mini emirates, so-called, being created within this prison system. What that means going forward is hard to know, of course, since it's hard to access if you're not within the Tunisian security establishment to interview or talk to these people. But as we saw last decade, starting in 2006 to 2011, when Tunisian jihadists were planning at the time for what they would do once they were released from prison, that eventually led to what became Ansar al-Sharia in Tunisia, which then led to everything that I've talked about today. So we can see how this prison population is very important to understand and see what's going on. But unfortunately, there is a gap in our information right now, and that's why it's important to focus on this issue, even if the foreign fighter mobilization specifically to Syria no longer is as relevant as it was 3, 4, 5 years ago, and so many people have returned home. So I'll leave it at that for now, and thank you for your time. I look forward to your questions. Thanks.
Well, first, let me thank Matt and Aaron and the Washington Institute for inviting me back today. It's always a pleasure to talk about Tunisia and foreign fighters, the two things that I seem to know best. The reason I got the foreign fighter job was because of Tunisia's experience having so many foreign fighters. One of the few good things that came out of the foreign fighter phenomenon. As the ambassador in Tunis, one of the questions that I got most often was, why are there so many foreign fighters from Tunisia? And when I was ambassador from 2012 to 2015, there wasn't really a very good answer to that question. Fortunately, we now have Aaron's report, which I think is one of the best I've seen, that explains the phenomenon and gets at this question of why there were so many foreign fighters from Tunisia. Per capita, I think Tunisia had the most of any source country. It's an important question because it highlights Tunisia's unique situation as a country dealing with terrorism and radicalization in the middle of a democratic transition. Many other countries dealt with the same problems, but they were not in the same sort of transition that Tunisia was in. Coming back to Aaron's study, I want to emphasize 2 points that he made, but I think two points that he got exactly right. First of all, the report makes clear that there are many reasons for the phenomenon. There's no single explanation for why there were so many foreign fighters from Tunisia. I'm not going to get into all the reasons, but Aaron talked about a number of the reasons, some of them political, some of them personal, some of it just due to economic conditions, some of it the appeal of the caliphate. I think the report emphasizing the many reasons for the phenomenon reflects the complex reality much more than some of the more simplistic explanations that we've seen elsewhere. And second, I think the report got the number just about right, 2,900 foreign fighters. That's lower than many other estimates, which I've seen that have gone up to 6,000 or more. The 2,900 number tracks quite well with the numbers that the Tunisian government are using now, and also the internal numbers of the U.S. government. So I think it's still quite a large number, particularly given the size of Tunisia, but it puts the problem in its proper perspective rather than as this huge phenomenon that it was not in reality. I'm going to shift gears a little bit and talk mostly about the political developments in Tunisia after the revolution that triggered the radicalization, which manifested itself not only in the foreign fighters, but also in the radicalization and the attacks inside of Tunisia. And after I go through that, I'm going to talk a little bit about the current situation and come back to the problems that are posed by the returning foreign fighters now. So first, a brief review of the history. In the aftermath of the revolution in 2011, there were, I think, three factors that set the stage for what happened afterwards. First was the amnesty for all political prisoners in 2011, which freed many dangerous jihadists. There was some debate at the time as to whether they should be included or not, and the feeling, which was pretty widespread in Tunisian society, was that if it was an amnesty, it had to include everybody who had been arrested by the previous regime for political reasons. So the consequences of that became evident later, but at the time it was thought that they had to be included in a general amnesty. Second was the shake-up within the security forces after the departure of President Ben Ali. This diminished the impact of this diminished the capacity of the security forces and helped contribute to some of the problems we saw afterwards. And third, I would point to what I would call the initial tolerance of the activities of the jihadists by the elected Troika government, which Aaron alluded to. This was in the period of 2012 to 2013. At the time, the leadership of Ennahda talked about dialogue with jihadists, not so much because they agreed with them in terms of their philosophy or their approach, but the feeling that they had to be brought into the system rather than be excluded from the system. That turned out to be a grave error that Ennahda realized later, but at the time it was widely held within the movement. So these three factors contributed, I think, to what I guess we could call a perfect storm, which allowed the jihadist groups to form in Tunisia, to recruit new members, to facilitate the travel of foreign fighters both to Libya and to Syria and Iraq, and eventually to organize attacks inside Tunisia. Turning to the response of the Tunisian government, I would go through 4 phases in tracking that. And I'd also note that since 2011, there have been 7 different prime ministers in Israel, in Tunisia, and even more governments. So it's not one single government. There were many different governments of different flavors in Tunisia. Of the 4 phases, I'd say the first was from the revolution in 2011 until about September of 2012, and it's a period that I would sort of characterize as a period of denial. After the initial amnesty, radical groups, especially Ansar al-Sharia Tunisia, were allowed to form and to organize openly. The government of Tunisia generally looked the other way, and fighters were allowed to leave for Syria for what was then viewed as a popular struggle against Bashar al-Assad. The security apparatus at the time was distracted by these internal fights and internal divisions after the departure of Ben Ali. The jihadists took advantage of the situation to strengthen themselves. And in this period, there was an initial outflow of foreign fighters, not as great as in the later period, but there was a flow out at this time. The jihadists also did not launch attacks inside Tunisia at this time, at least through the summer of 2012. The second phase, which I would date from about September 2012 to 2014, was one in which the Tunisian government realized that it had a problem and first began to grapple with it. The radical groups, particularly Ansar al-Sharia Tunisia, began to carry out operations within Tunisia itself, beginning with the attack on the U.S. Embassy in September 2012, around the same time as the attack on Benghazi. This was followed by 2 political assassinations carried out by jihadists in 2013. The Tunisian government began slowly to crack down. The first steps included the designation of Ansar Sharia Tunisia as a terrorist group by the Troika government in August 2013, that Aaron pointed out. The subsequent government, technocratic government led by Prime Minister Mehdi Joma, began much closer cooperation with the United States and other foreign partners in 2014. With this came the beginning of an improvement of the capacity of the security forces to deal with terrorism and radicalization. This period in which there was a crackdown within Tunisia ironically led to an increased flow of foreign fighters to Libya and Syria and Iraq. With the groups under pressure inside Tunisia, it was easier for their members to leave, and this also coincided with the rise of Islamic State. So there was both a pull from the region as well as a push from the underlying forces that were pushing people to go to fight. The third phase, roughly 2015 to 2016, was one of an active response and a more effective response by the Tunisian government. With the newly elected government in place after 2014, the jihadists launched deadly attacks on civilian targets inside Tunisia, notably the attack on the Bardo Museum and the Hotel in Sousse, frequented by European tourists. This led the government of Tunisia to begin a much more active and ultimately more effective response. They passed a new counterterrorism law in July 2015. And with this greater improvement in security capacity, there was also more success in reducing the foreign fighter flow, aided by improved international cooperation and restrictions by transit countries. And finally, the fourth phase, which ran from about 2017 to the present, is one in which the focus shifted more to returnees. As I said, the flow of foreign fighters going out was way down. The government and the security forces turned their attention to the problem of returnees, of which I think Aaron used the number of 970, which again I think is a number that reflects the reality and also is a number that's approximates what you hear from the Tunisian and the U.S. government when they talk about this. There's been a public debate in Tunisia about what to do about returnees. There's been also a realization of a need for a broader approach, not just a security-based approach, but there's only been limited success in bringing this about. And let me now turn again to this current situation and the focus on the returning fighters. Currently, I'd say security is much improved, certainly compared to 2012 or 2015. The security forces have been largely successful in preventing attacks since December 2015. The one exception being the recent suicide attack in Tunis, although this left dead only the attacker. The attacker wasn't successful in killing any other victims. There's at the present no significant outflow of foreign fighters. However, little has been done to address the underlying motivations for the radicalization And as Aaron pointed out, radical cells could resume their activity and destabilize the country again if given the opportunity. Generally speaking, in terms of the 970 that have returned, the Tunisian government knows who they are and has been able to identify them when they return through official border crossings. Some of them still continue to smuggle their way back through Libya, and they're harder to track down, but for the most part, when they come through border crossings, the Tunisian government is able to identify them. However, the government has no comprehensive plan on what to do with them once they are identified. In most cases, returnees are interviewed by the security forces at the time of entry, and prosecutors decide whether or not to prosecute. The 2015 anti-terrorism law makes it a crime to travel outside Tunisia to support a terrorist group. However, prosecutors often have found it difficult to develop evidence to successfully make a case against individuals. So while some high-profile cases have been prosecuted and people sent to jail, many others are not. This is a fundamental weakness of the system, and it demonstrates the need for more capacity building in the judicial sector to deal not just with this problem, but the problems more broadly in the sector. For those who are not prosecuted, they're released. In principle, they are monitored by the security forces. However, in Tunisia, as in elsewhere in other source countries, the security forces don't have the resources to fully monitor all of the returnees. Europeans have the same problem, although the numbers are not as great relative to the size of the country as it is in Tunisia. So this is another weakness of the system currently. Also, there's no nationwide program for reintegration, either of returnees from abroad or for radicals who were released from prison after serving sentences for domestic attacks. This is perhaps the greatest weakness of the system. While the local authorities sometimes deal with radicalized individuals on an ad hoc basis, they have very limited means at their disposal, and they have no specialized training to deal with these individual cases. There are some cases where the security forces take a particular interest in the individuals. This has been the case with some of the Tunisians returned from Guantanamo. And in those cases, the security forces do keep track of them, but generally this is the exception rather than the rule. There are models of reintegration that exist in Europe, in Morocco, and Saudi Arabia, but for a variety of reasons, Tunisia has lagged behind in this, and they really still do not have a comprehensive plan to deal with this problem of returnees. Finally, again, as Aaron pointed out, prisons in Tunisia are overcrowded and a breeding ground for both recruitment and radicalization. Tunisia is receiving assistance from the U.S. now in prison management, but Tunisia still has to devote more attention and resources to this problem to address the overcrowding and to prevent radicalization from being bred within the prison system. Up until now, Tunisia has addressed these problems primarily through security means and through the security forces. That probably made sense initially, but I think we're at the point now where Tunisia needs to look more broadly at other areas, its social programs to support de-radicalization and reintegration, at capacity building in the judicial sector, prison reforms, and other steps to address some of the underlying causes of the radicalization. Finally, I'd note that these security issues are intertwined with political and economic issues in Tunisia. As I told Tunisian friends when I was ambassador, Tunisia, to succeed in its democratic transition, has to make progress not only on security, but also on the economy and on the political front. I described it as a three-legged stool, where each of the pillars has to be strong, and Tunisia has to make progress on all three at the same time in order to succeed in the transition to democracy. The economy is under great pressure right now. The state budget has limited resources available for dealing with problems like returning foreign fighters. This is an ongoing challenge. It's one that will be highlighted in the coming year when there will be legislative and presidential elections in Tunisia, and this will be an issue that will certainly be part of the discussion then. I think with that, I'll stop Happy to take your questions. And once again, it's a pleasure to be here and to be on the panel. Thanks.
Thanks to both you, Aaron and Jacob, for fabulous presentations. I will ask the moderators, take the moderator's prerogative and ask your first question, which really is intended to give all of you another minute or two to formulate your brilliant questions. And then we have plenty of time. I'll call on everybody as I see you. Just please wait for the microphone and identify yourself before you ask your question. So I'll ask kind of one question to the both of you, which is two parts, both focused on this issue of motivations. Because, Aaron, when I read the paper, the two things that most jumped out at me as not the only, but the biggest contributions were, as you both highlighted already, the issue of being able to really drill down on the numbers, but also being able to have a really serious conversation about the kind of waterfront of motivations that affected this phenomenon. I want to ask one question about the motivations in the past leading to what happened. I want to ask a similar question about the motivations going forward. Can you, each of you, try and give me a little bit of a deeper dive into how these motivations, which ultimately affected all foreign fighter travelers from everywhere, they're not particularly unique to Tunisia, minus the particular issues of the nascent democratization and, Jacob, what you referred to as phase one denial. Mm-hmm. Other than that key distinction, one could make a pretty strong case that just about every other factor was present in at least some cases, in Libya, in Egypt, and elsewhere. And I'm wondering if that is the critical issue in terms of motivations, or if there were other things that were going on within Tunisia that exacerbated some or all of the many motivations that affected different people in different places that led to the fact that per capita, we still can't get away with this, even at the lesser numbers of 2,900 who went and 2,700 who were frustrated travelers who were stopped. 27,000, excuse me. Let me add a zero and a comma, and you okay.
Make your point.
Per capita,
that's a lot of people.
that's a tremendous number of people, and all of the motivations we've discussed are equal for all people in Tunisia or elsewhere. That's question A. Question B is looking forward, picking up where you both ended off, and that is, as we think about not only the returnees, which are a fairly reasonable number, actually quite a lot, but fairly reasonable, of about 970. Dealing with 27,000 frustrated travelers, that's actually a tremendous headache. And we also have the problem not only of the frustrated travelers and the returnees, and I would include in the basket of returnees those who are released from prison, those who have exited one battle space, whether it's Iraq or Syria, and have not come home but have gone someplace else, meaning they'll do something someplace else and they could yet come home to Tunisia, especially if the place to which they exited was Libya. What, if anything, can we learn about the prospect of just how dangerous these people are from the different motivations that drove them? We have here some colleagues from Europol, and I love to use Europol's methodology for thinking about returnees to Europe in its TSAT report, where you can put these basically into three buckets. You can put these in the buckets of people who are disenfranchised and they were really disappointed, and the caliphate turned out to be nothing like what they were told it would be, and these people are probably okay. And you have at the other end of the extreme, people who are returning and are just as radical, or maybe even more radical than when they went, and they still want to do things, and that's very dangerous, and that's also very, very small. And you have this kind of large middle of people who are, not as angry as they once were, but they're still a little bit angry. They are still somewhat radical. They could be re-radicalized. And you have that kind of larger population in the middle, which isn't necessarily presenting a threat today, but isn't entirely turned off either. So as we're looking forward ahead at how to deal with the phenomenon of the frustrated travelers and the returnees and those who have exited, how much hope can we have that at least a decent number of these maybe were driven by motivations that may make them not as long-term radicals as we might have feared.
Okay.
Two
There's
parts.
a lot going on. But
A lot going on. 2 parts.
I mean, I agree that I think a lot of the motivations for why Tunisians went are very similar to other Arab countries, other European countries in general. But I do think the particular ingredients of what happened in Tunisia after 2011 is extremely relevant because without the open conditions first for Ansar al-Sharia to proselytize and recruit people, and then also with that, the government not really doing too much to deal with it. Because of that, you had a lot larger group of people exposed and then interested in these ideas than would have been otherwise. If there wasn't those particular conditions, you would have still seen Tunisians going to Syria, no doubt, but the numbers might have been more maybe akin to Morocco or Algeria or Egypt, which, didn't have those same kind of large-scale openness to allow jihadis just to proselytize for 2.5 years so period. So I think that is the key right there in many respects, and I think that has important implications in the future if we do ever see some type of Arab Spring scenario again, or just one particular country where there's some type of overthrow of a government where people are released from prison, or maybe there should be a process where people who had been charged for terrorism-related crimes before that government was overthrown be retried again based off of the specific evidence instead of just letting people out carte blanche. I think that's a really important implication if that happened in, say, Algeria or Saudi Arabia or wherever. I mean, obviously, I'm just coming up with countries off the top of my head. I don't know what's going to happen in the future, of course. But it's important. But also what's important is understanding the dynamic between the Nahda and Ansar al-Sharia and what we could learn about, Islamists being in power and them dealing with jihadists. Of course, as we know, they are ideological rivals, but they're also within a broader ideological stream that's more close than them and the secular stream. So there are reasons why they're allowed to operate in a way that maybe some secular or communist group that got really popular wouldn't have been able to. And I think that's important if you look at maybe, say, the future of Turkey or some other future scenario that, could happen. In terms of the other question related to returnees, frustrated travelers, those who have exited and gone elsewhere, we have seen, of course, people going to Libya. The Tunisians were the largest group that went to Libya. And if you're interested more in that, I also wrote a report about that came out earlier this year in January called The Others, Foreign Fighters in Libya. So there's a lot of details there as well. But we have seen Tunisians showing up in other places as well, whether it's Mali or the Philippines. Of course, it's, people here or there. It's not like dozens or anything larger than that. It's maybe a handful at most. So it's nowhere near on the same level. But we have seen this happening. But in terms of the potential, as you note, for the possibility of people getting mobilized again or getting interest again who might have been disillusioned by IS's implementation of the Islamic State, but not necessarily disillusioned with the ideology writ large in the same way, I'm sure people have heard maybe on college campuses or elsewhere that, China or the Soviet Union didn't do communism quite the right way, but if it was in a pure utopian way, then, it would work out. It's the same kind of, scenario in some regards, where you can see this happening. And one way I could see this is if you do see another change in the government this coming fall when there's another election in Tunisia and Ennahda comes into power again. I don't think that they would follow the same policy that they did from 2011 to 2013, but I do think that they would be a lot more open to sort of the social programs and a lot of the rehabilitation and reintegration aspect of it, but that could then also lead to more open ability where people could interact again and lead to more ability to mobilize people. Maybe not necessarily within Tunisia, but possibly to do stuff abroad again. But again, I can't predict the future, but that is one potential scenario where that could happen, which unfortunately would probably create even more political polarization in Tunisia. but we'll see what happens in the future.
Just a few points I'd add. I think the question sort of gets at the question about motivation sort of is a good one because and I think we've seen this in the report, that all of the motivations that we saw in the Tunisian case are equally applicable in Morocco or Algeria or other comparable countries. There were two things I think that were different about Tunisia that explain it. One is what Aaron already just pointed out, which is that Tunisia was essentially a free society, that the jihadists were free to go online, to organize in person. As early as 2011, Ansar Sharia Tunisia was having a national congress in Tunisia where they were openly talking about jihad. They were openly talking about the destruction of Israel and all kinds of other things like that. So that freedom which existed in Tunisia didn't exist in Morocco or Algeria or many other places. But there was a second factor that was unique to Tunisia, I think, which is Libya. Libya being next door and the border between Tunisia and Libya being so easy to get across, there was a real magnetic attraction from Libya, which at the time, as we recall, was also going through its own revolution. There were jihadist groups all over the place. They were operating freely. There were terrorist camps in Libya that it was very easy for a Tunisian to go across the border, be trained in a camp in Libya, and then be sent through Istanbul into Syria for the fight with Islamic State or Nusra or others. So that's the one thing that it was very different than the Tunisian case in, say, Morocco or Algeria, where you can get to Libya, but it's a lot harder. Or you can get to Syria, but you've got to go through a couple other places to get there, and it's either easier to be stopped. In terms of looking forward, I think you do have this large pool of frustrated travelers, of returnees, of indigenous radical cells and groups that continue to exist in Tunisia, and I think it's a real threat looking forward. What Tunisia has gotten better at in the years since 2011, 2012 is sort of balancing a free society with security, and how you can continue to have an open debate, freedom of the press, political freedoms, but at the same time have a security force that can deal with the problems of radicalization and terror. That's a difficult balance that we face here, other countries face as well. Tunisia is doing better at it, but it's a tricky thing, and given the political turmoil, given the fact that they're about to have elections in Tunisia this year, going off the rails is a definite possibility. So it's something to be concerned about, and I think people that care about what's going on in Tunisia need to be attentive to that problem.
Okay, on that high note, let me open it up to your questions. We'll start right here. Just wait for the mic, please, and identify yourself. Right here in the middle.
Hi, Marina Mansour, State Department. I have two questions. The first question is, how do you think Arab governments can sort of weigh the, freedom of speech, freedom of association issues when it comes to political Islam, to where they don't necessarily crack down on it to an extent where it creates a backlash? And then how do they find that balance? And then the second question is for Aaron. You said that in Tunisia, Daesh was mostly, or the Tunisians joining ISIS were sort of in administrative ranks, or not necessarily involved in the killing and the fighting as much as perhaps others. How does that impact the way that the fighters see themselves? And how does that sort of factor into the overall structure of ISIS and their ranks?
Okay.
Should I go first?
Yeah, you can answer the first one.
Well, Tunisia is one of the few places in the Arab world that's trying to find a balance, as you were talking about, between dealing with the security problem and allowing free expression of political Islam. In Egypt and in the Gulf, you basically have no debate. You basically have no balance. It's basically all about a crackdown. I would point out that was the Tunisian approach before the revolution. That was exactly what Ben Ali did he arrested a lot of the jihadists. He put them in prison, but that sort of incubated the problem within the prisons. And then once they were released, they were free to do what they wanted. What Tunisia is trying to do now is, as you were saying, to find this balance, and they're doing better at finding that balance, I think, than anywhere else in the region. But again, going forward, it's a hard balance to do. One of the advantages that Tunisia had, say, compared to Egypt, was that you had an Islamist party, Ennahda. There was a large and influential party, but they did not have a majority, and they were never able to rule by themselves. Even when they were leading the government from 2012 to 14, they were part of the Troika, so they had coalition partners. That put certain brakes on what they could do, and it also influences the policy that they adopted. In Egypt, on the other hand, the Muslim Brotherhood had a majority. They very clearly overreached, and then they provoked the reaction on the part of the army, and that was something that was very evident to Rashid Ghannouchi at the time, and he and I discussed this a lot. He was very conscious of the fact that they did not have a majority and they had to temper what they did. And I think that's even reflected now, where they have a role in the government, but they're not taking the leading role in the government. That was a conscious decision on their part to step back.
All right. In terms of the second question, it is true that a lot of Tunisians took part in administrative roles. There were Tunisians, of course, that were involved in fighting and were involved in the beheadings. I mean, a lot of people viewed Tunisians with ISIS as the head choppers, so they weren't completely innocent of a lot of ISIS's crimes, for sure. But because they were, many of them, in administrative roles, part of that is because of the experiences they gained with the social services type of activities and outreach in Tunisia from 2011 to 13. I think it provides actually an opportunity for Tunisia, if they play their cards right, is that many of these individuals want to do something on behalf of society. It's just bringing them back in the fold under the rubric of the Tunisian nation state instead of the IS or Al-Qaeda theocratic state, or however you want to describe it. And therefore, if you provide these opportunities or make entrepreneurship more open, cut down on the red tape related to business regulations, that you can get a lot of these youth more involved in helping out Tunisia specifically. The question is whether the bureaucratic aspects of the Tunisian state can do that quickly or not remains to be seen. But I do think this is actually in some ways a positive. The question is whether it can be harnessed or not.
In the back.
Hello, Hussam Bagas. I'm a grad student at NC State. My question is, the challenge was everybody is fearing the people, the returnees, as both you mentioned. But the big challenge so far after 2015 was the people who never left, the 27,000, nearly 30,000 people. And the recruitment by Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State, also the terrorist attack in July on the Algerian border. What does that, or to what extent that, how we say, to what extent that threat to the region, like the stability of Algeria or Libya and Tunisia? Thank you.
In terms of those who didn't leave, what's interesting is if you look at the networks in relation to what's gone on since around 2015, is that with the case of the Bardo and Sousse attack, it was connected to these series of training camps in Sabratha, Libya, which is just on the other side of the Tunisian border, and was run by originally guys that were associated with AQIM, but then switched to ISIS. And therefore, it was Tunisians that were not inside of Tunisia, but they were then able to go back into Tunisia and conduct the attacks. And then what's interesting about the other side of the border in Jebel Shambi region in Kasserine Governorate is that a number of the individuals involved in that group, Katibat Uqba and Nafi, which is essentially AQIM's Tunisia group, is that it's connected to AQIM in Algeria. All of the leaders of Katibat Uqba and Nafi have actually been Algerian, not Tunisian. So you do see these cross-border connections. What's interesting, though, is that even though you saw this spike in violence in 2015, Since then, it's gone down a lot, and it's relatively remained consistent from both Katibat Uqba bin Nafi as well as IS's Tunisia affiliate. All of them sort of are operating mainly in Kasserine Governorate, whereby over the last 3 years, each group has conducted about the same number of attacks each year, meaning it hasn't gotten worse, but the problem hasn't been completely resolved. The thing, though, is that each group has only conducted about 3 or 4 attacks each a year, which obviously is a tragedy no matter what. But compared to, say, Nigeria or Somalia or Iraq or Syria, I mean, it's not a lot, and in many ways is probably comparable to a place like France. When you put it in perspective and the fact that there are so many people that weren't able to go to Iraq and Syria, and that you've seen such low level of violence in the past few years, maybe we can take a positive out of it. I don't know.
Can I just add one
real quick.
one addition to that, which is you have a large pool of potentially radicalized people. You don't have the leadership that existed and was free to operate, say, in 2011, 2012. A lot of the leadership of these groups went to Syria, Iraq, people that you mentioned, people like Ali and Tariq al-Harzi, or they went to Libya and they were in the Sabrata camp. Those leaders are basically taken out either by U.S. Special Forces or by other groups. In particular, Ali and Tariq al-Harzi, they were assisted in their dream of martyrdom by U.S. Special Forces.
David, over here in the corner.
Thanks very much. Dave Pollack from the Washington Institute. That 27,000 is really quite a startling number. And so my question, I think, is a simple factual one. What happened to all those people? Are they all in jail? Are they what?
There's a few thousand people in jail, but the rest are out and about. It's possible because they're stopped, they then didn't go on farther within a radicalization process, and they didn't get as radical as they might have been if they actually went abroad, and therefore maybe decided not to get more involved. But it's hard to know without some type of anthropological study or ethnography. But luckily there hasn't been as much violence as could have potentially been if you hear the numbers.
Yeah, I think a lot of the sourcing for those numbers come from people that the Tunisian government stopped between a certain age group. So basically, any male between the ages of 17 and 30 that were stopped from leaving the country by the Tunisian government are in that pool. So some of them are probably hardcore radicals, but not everybody necessarily was. And it's really, as Aaron was saying, it's hard to know unless you sort of interviewed each of them or did a sampling, which is kind of hard to do. Is there a list of names? I suppose the Tunisian government would know the 27,000 people or so that they stopped from going. I don't know how much analysis they've done on that either.
Yeah. They won't share that list. To me, the biggest concern, as we said earlier regarding how Europol thinks about this, is that it's not static either. Yeah. Let's say that the 27,000 is off by a large number because a significant number of people of a certain age who weren't actually going to do something or then thought better of it once they were stopped and are let's discount it by a third, right? And let's say another big chunk is whatever you have in there, a large middle of people who today they're a little less radical, but tomorrow something happens, they could get radicalized again. It's not static. And so no government, certainly not the government of Tunisia, a government that size, has the wherewithal to keep tabs on all these people. Over time, you rank them, and someone who ranks a little lower may not get as much attention, but could be radicalized and move up without your knowing it. So it's a tremendous problem. If you think about how much ink has been spilled over the problem that European law enforcement faces, and this is a larger number of known, at least people who were stopped to travel. All right, next question. We had one over here, right next to the mic, and then we'll come over here.
Stanley Kober. There was a saying from the Vietnam War that the light at the end of the tunnel is the train coming right at you. We're hearing a lot of very positive stuff out of the administration that Islamic State has been all but defeated. on its last legs. But when I hear the numbers that you're saying, the radicalization in the prisons, which I haven't heard discussed much, I'm getting a sense, deja vu all over again. And so, yeah, you're nodding. So could you just say a few words about that? It's broader than Tunisia.
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously not completely resolved, whether in Tunisia or in Iraq or Syria for that matter. As we know, while people talk about how IS no longer controls territory, they still do control some territory in the Syrian side of the Syrian-Iraqi border. It's very small now. It's only in one city, I believe, Hajin. But you already see, at least in Iraq, that the group itself is rebuilding its insurgent capacities in places like Diyala, Kirkuk, these seam areas where there's sort of like the border between different ethnic or religious groups, and therefore they can take advantage and play on some of these dynamics. And we've seen the growth in sort of assassination campaigns against sort of local leaders within the communities in different Iraqi villages and cities in the same way we saw in Iraq from 2011 to 2013 in the lead up to sort of the resurrection of ISIS. So there is definitely warning signs again. If you want to look towards what could come next from ISIS in their plan, the thing that would come next then is them trying to do prison breaks again, which we saw in 2013, especially, which then led to them bolstering their capacities, which of course then led to them taking over territory in Iraq and Syria. So that would be the thing I would look out for right now, but it's definitely not over in my opinion.
In the back row, put your hand up so they can see where to bring the light. Mike, there you go.
Thanks. David Sturman from New America. So your paper focuses in on this sort of national mobilization, which seems very correct compared to, say, Libyan's ISIS records, where it's such a Derna story. But if you run it through sort of per capita numbers, there do seem to be some particular standout spots. And I wanted to ask you about one in particular, which is the southern border governorates. Your data and ours at New America on different cuts of the ISIS records both put Kabylie as the top governorate in terms of per capita. You also have Medellin and in particular the Ben Gurdon area as disproportionate production of fighters in per capita terms. Is there something different going on there? Is that the same as the Grand Tunis and Bizerte mobilization? And also, is that new? My understanding is the Sinjar records, when it was cut in the early analysis for sub-national level, didn't actually have really anyone from the sort of southern peripheral areas. Thanks.
So in terms of Ben Gurdon, I mean, I think we've seen historical mobilization from there, including Iraq. The problem with the Sinjar records is that I think there were only about like 27 or 30 Tunisians in them. So when you compare that to around the 589 to 640 Tunisians in the more recent ISIS documents, it's hard to extrapolate too much from the Sinjar records. But in terms of the Kabylie case, it is interesting. Obviously, you'd have to go locally and really understand what was going on there. But at least from my research into Ansar al-Sharia in 2011 to 2013 is that the group had an operation there and a branch there where they were conducting events. So it is certainly possible that because of that infrastructure there, that allowed more people to then be exposed to the potential recruitment and facilitation networks to Libya, Iraq, and Syria. So that's the thing I could think of off the top of my head. But again, you'd probably need to go there locally to really interview people and find out more.
Great. Any more questions? Yes.
Thanks. This is Louisa Keeler from POMED. Earlier this year, there was this whole issue with the EU blacklist in Tunisia, and Tunisia was limited from receiving, and is still in some ways limited from receiving certain types of financing because people are concerned about the security risks, basically, of kind of pouring money into the country. At the same time, it seems like Tunisia is really desperate for financial assistance, and the civil society groups that I think you mentioned, Aaron, that could help with some of the de-radicalization programs are also limited in what they can do and what sort of funding they can receive. It seems to me like sort of a chicken and egg scenario, and I'm wondering if, as there's more and more returning fighters, is there a right answer for if, the risk is too great, or if actually this is the best way to solve the problem is by kind of encouraging financial assistance?
I mean, I definitely think people should try. Of course, it doesn't mean you'll be successful necessarily, but you can learn from possible failures or mistakes too, which is important. I mean, that's part of one of the biggest issues with the whole CVE game, is that at least in some countries, they're too afraid to do something because they're afraid of failure. But then if you don't try something, then you don't know what might work or might not work, and then learn from that in the future. So I definitely think it's worth it to help out. And there's even Tunisians who were previously jihadists, who want to be involved in some of these efforts as well, because they know from their own experience what it was like. They can relate to these people more, and they can help out. So there's also opportunities in relation to that with formers, which could be really useful in many regards, in contrast to maybe a purely like secular type oriented organization that might not be able to relate as much. So I definitely agree that it's important.
We had a question right here in the middle, please.
Hi, I'm Madeline Branch with the State Department. Aaron, you had mentioned some of the female fighters, and I was hoping you could talk a little bit more about that and what strategies might need to change in dealing with this as the numbers are growing, especially with the recent attack in October.
Yeah, so it's an interesting case that you've seen a lot of Tunisian women getting involved. Part of this is because they were given a role within Ansar al-Sharia, as an organization from 2011 to 13, so there were more women involved in general, and it wasn't. And the thing always to remember is that unlike in other contexts where everything was always about fighting, this wasn't just about fighting, and therefore the possibility of role was greater, not just for men but women as well, and therefore they're exposed to greater things. And then within the IS context, as I noted, they were involved in some security-related arrangements, but they're also involved in the administrative side as well. So it's definitely become a larger issue, and we've seen the same dynamic in Libya as well with IS in Libya. What's interesting is the case of the woman who conducted that attack. Thankfully, nobody was killed, but it does augur to the potential that because more women have been involved in this movement, have been exposed to it, and are interested, and the idea of feminism is very strong in Tunisia, and these women view themselves as sort of like feminist jihadis. I know that sounds interesting, but in their minds it makes sense that they will just act on their own accord. And we have seen in other cases that women have done attacks in the UK and in Australia, as well as more war zone like places. It's definitely something that could happen more, but of course, I can't predict the future specifically.
Can I ask you both to comment on why the threat from North Africa, from Tunisia, from Libya to Southern Europe doesn't appear to have turned out to be as dangerous as we thought it might have been?
I'll go. Look, I mean, I think part of the answer is that the Europeans are doing a better job now in managing the threat. That wasn't true, say, in 2015. It's more true now, and in a way, the biggest problem I think that Europe has faced is not radicals coming in from say Tunisia into the south. It's more the indigenous populations of Tunisians and Algerians and Moroccans and others that are already settled in the northern countries, particularly in France and in Belgium.
Yeah, most of the Tunisians that have tried to go into Europe have been interdicted along the way, or so it illustrates that they're doing a relatively good job. In terms of Italy in particular, they've also deported I don't know, I'd have to look at my data, but at least 50, 70, or 80 Tunisian jihadists over the last 3 or 4 years back to Tunisia. So that's one strategy at least the Italians have taken. I know that the French have also deported some people, but not on that scale.
Yep. All right. Any other questions? In that case, please join me in thanking our panelists for a wonderful discussion. Aaron, congratulations on the publication of the study.
Thank you.
Jacob, thank you so much for joining us today. As always, thank you all for coming on a cold winter day. Feel free to take some more food or coffee on the way out. Have a great afternoon.